to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen in to a book talk by Nina Jankowicz about her new book, How to Lose the Information War: Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. Ms. Jankowicz's book covers efforts of disinformation by the Russian Republic in Estonia, Georgia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine, and of course, the United States. She argues that disinformation shouldn't be viewed strictly from a technical perspective. Indeed, as she points out, there is always a significant homegrown component of disinformation, wherein successful disinformation takes advantage of pre-existing fissures and issues within society and exacerbates divisions and emotions surrounding them. She argues, therefore, that a successful response to disinformation must have a strong human component, as exemplified by the example of Estonia and Sweden. And she argues that it's impossible to mount an effective campaign against disinformation when some portions of your society engage in those same tactics yourself. The conversation is wide-ranging and was held at the Clements Center at the University of Texas at Austin, hosted in part by the Clements Center, by the Strauss Center, particularly the Intelligence Studies Project, and hosted by Dr. Kirill Abramov of the Global Disinformation Lab and Jaime Cabrera, a Brumley Fellow at the LBJ School. Let's listen in.
My name is Kirill Abramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm a fellow to the ISP, to the Intelligence Studies Project at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, but also I'm part of the Global Disinformation Lab that was established in 2020 at UT Austin in order to encourage collaborative interdisciplinary academic research and on the global circulation of broad spectrum of information, misinformation, disinformation via digital and legacy media. And we're very interested actually today in the talk to hear some comments specifically on the examples that are discussed in the case studies in the book. And we deal with weaponized narratives and those harm grades that hopefully we'll have time to discuss. But also in our work, we include students such as the ones part of the Bromley Next Generation Fellowship Program, which provides research training and mentorship opportunities to exceptional graduate students at UT Austin. Strauss Center has currently 11 Bromley Fellows, and one of them will be assisting me today. His name is Jaime Cabrera, who is a second-year Masters of Global Policy student at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where he specialized on internet governance. And at this point of time, without further ado, I would ask Jaime to introduce our very interesting original thinker who will be able to present her book today. Jaime?
Great. Thank you so much for that welcome message. And thank you everyone for being here. We're about to start, and I would just wanted to introduce our speaker today, Nina Jankowicz. She studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. Ms. Jankowicz has advised the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship. Her writing has been published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and others. She is a frequent television and radio commentator on disinformation and Russian and Eastern European affairs. Prior to her Fulbright grant in Ukraine, Ms. Jankowicz managed democracy assistance programs to Russia and Belarus at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She received her MA in Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and her BA from Bryn Mawr College. So thank you so much for being with us, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Dr. Avramov. It's wonderful to be at UT Austin today. I only wish that I could be with you in person. And before we start, I just want to say that I hope everyone who's listening in today, who's in Texas, is on the up and up, that your families and you are safe. And we've certainly been thinking of you in my household. So just a little bit more about me and my background, which I think gives a good window onto how I came about writing this book. I am the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. We are the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only president with a PhD. And I think my title, Disinformation Fellow, is probably one of the best titles in Washington. It should probably be Counter Disinformation Fellow, but nobody asked me when they gave me that title. So here we are. And in my work at the Wilson Center, I really try to link up the research I do with policy solutions. So I'm up on the Hill giving testimony to Congress. I brief members of Congress and allied governments. We've hosted workshops with members of parliaments from foreign countries and staffers from Capitol Hill, trying to get into these problems to really learn how to recognize and counter disinformation in a democratic way. And that emphasis on supporting democracy and preserving freedom of speech really comes from my initial work, which Jaime mentioned. Early on in my career, I was the program officer for Russia and Belarus programs at the National Democratic Institute, which is a democracy support organization. And that's really where I got my first exposure to disinformation as a concept. Obviously, academic exposure, learning about how the Soviet Union used disinformation happened during all of my studies. But in terms of practice, NDI was really where I first encountered it. And I joined NDI after the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, had been asked to leave Russia by the Russian government. And NDI was in part funded by USAID. And we became a target of Russian domestic disinformation. There were a lot of hit stories on us and the folks that we partnered with. There were cartoons of us in the Russian media. There were, all sorts of exposés on Russian states-funded media. And as a result, our programs had to leave Russia and operate offshore. And that's when I really started thinking about how do we counter these narratives? How do we get in front of them? How do we be more proactive rather than just constantly responding to the false allegations that the Kremlin was putting out? And then the Ukraine crisis began just a little bit into my time at NDI. And it became clear then that it wasn't just something that the Russian government was using against organizations like NDI. It was a weapon in some ways of war. And certainly in the Ukrainian context, the information war was paired very deliberately with the kinetic war in the Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea. And so that's the background that I come through all of this from. My study of disinformation is comparative. I lived in Ukraine for a year as a Fulbright Clinton Fellow, as Jaime said. I was advising the Ukrainian government on strategic communications and really saw firsthand how a government like Ukraine, which unfortunately, was really struggling economically, was struggling in terms of its sovereignty, was still trying to address these issues and was thinking about them in a lot of ways in a more advanced fashion than we were in the West. And I was there at a very consequential time in 2016 and 2017. As the United States and the Western world was really just coming to grips for the very first time with the idea of foreign disinformation, with the revelations of 2016 election interference by the Kremlin in the US election. And I really felt, as I was sitting in Kyiv watching all of this happen, waking up day after day to another headline about Russian interference, that we were approaching this problem with a really unique sense of American hubris, that this had never happened before to anyone else, and that we were the first to experience it. It wasn't worth looking at what happened in places like Ukraine or Estonia, or even looking at the historical record of Russia's use of these tactics in decades past, and that we had to kind of reinvent the wheel in order to solve this problem. That was extraordinarily frustrating for me, looking at what Kyiv was doing, sitting with my colleagues, my Ukrainian colleagues in the ministry every day, interviewing people around the continent as part of my Fulbright project who were responding to these issues, and seeing how completely disconnected that was from the discourse in the United States. And that's why I decided to write this book. My book, How to Lose the Information War, really brings all of that to bear. It looks at 5 countries: Estonia, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, not our friends in the state of Georgia, Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine. And it also looks at the United States and what we've learned since 2016 and a few more current examples. And it's not focused on as much on the tools and tactics that Russia uses as it is focused on the responses to those tools and tactics, how governments organize themselves, how civil society pitches in to either help or in some cases hinder the efforts that governments are putting forward. And at the core of all of this is the idea that disinformation is a threat to democracy. It's not a partisan issue. It's not something that should be used as political cannon fodder. It's something that affects all of us and our ability to engage with the democratic process. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as some of the goals of Russian disinformation and some of the main themes from the book, which I think have really been brought into stark relief in the past year as we've dealt with election disinformation, as we've dealt with COVID myths. So starting with some of the goals of Russian disinformation, which I view in three ways. First, I think there are a lot of people and a lot of misconceptions that think, the Kremlin wants a certain political outcome in the United States or in Germany or in Ukraine. To some extent, that's true in the short term. But when we're talking about the long term, I actually don't buy into that assertion. What I think the Kremlin is looking to do is to undermine Western democracy writ large. And that's shown by the fact that the Kremlin is often playing on both sides of the same issue. We've seen the Kremlin support, for instance, Bernie Sanders as well as Donald Trump. And the idea is to polarize us, to pit us against one another, to create this sense of discontent and chaos in our society. And what does that do? That goes toward the second goal that the Kremlin has, which is when we are consumed by our own problems at home, when we are pit against one another and polarized, we are paying less attention to what the Kremlin is doing abroad. And it's near abroad, or perhaps it's far abroad. It's adventurism in places like Ukraine, the Central African Republic, Venezuela, Syria. When we're consumed by our own problems at home, we have less energy. We have fewer resources to spend worrying about what the Kremlin is doing abroad. And then finally, the third goal is domestic in nature. It fuels the Kremlin's whataboutism. Just in a conversation with the Brumley Fellows just now, we were talking a little bit about the decision by Amnesty International to remove Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident's prisoner of conscience status. Or we could talk, for instance, about how protesters and media were treated during the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. Both of these instances have fueled domestic propaganda that the Kremlin has engaged in at home. And this allows Vladimir Putin and his cronies to say to protesters who might be asking for Navalny's release, or to the folks who were on the streets of the far eastern town Khabarovsk over the summer demanding a more democratic form of governance, he can say to them, it's very nice that you want democracy, but look at what democracy is doing in the United States right now, in that shining city on a hill. How's that working out for them? Aren't you glad that you have order rather than freedom here in Russia? And the same thing could be said of the COVID pandemic and the United States handling of the COVID situation. Russia has been using that in its domestic propaganda as well. And disinformation fuels all three of these goals. Again, the undermining of Western democracy, the distraction from Russia's adventurism abroad, and again, the whataboutism in Russia's domestic information environment. And so the countries I highlight in my book, as I said, teach us three main lessons. The first is that there's a homegrown element to all of the disinformation operations that we're talking about. Just like there's a misconception around Russia wanting a certain political outcome in its disinformation operations, I think there is a large misconception, and this has only become more true as we experienced the 2020 election. There's this misconception that most of the disinformation operations that exist run on trolls and bots, that it's just a bunch of fake accounts and silly memes on the internet, and we can ignore them. Why does anybody buy into them? When in actuality, Russian disinformation, domestic disinformation, any disinformation that we are encountering in today's day and age, and in fact, in decades past as well, runs on emotion. It runs on real grievances in our society that are weaponized in order to get people to feel a certain way, to act even. And I'll give you an example of how this isn't just about Russian trolls. It's about what we call information laundering. So you take a narrative and it is laundered into the authentic American or German or Polish discourse, so that it's a lot more difficult for a social media platform to say, we're going to take action against this post because it's from an authentic local voice. And my favorite story of this is one that's a little bit personal to me, actually. in my free time, as you can probably tell by me using my hands as I speak, I used to do a lot of theater, musical theater. And when I was living in Ukraine, about to come home in July of 2017, I got an ad on my Facebook feed that was advertising a protest in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 2017. And it was for musical theater lovers to come out dressed in colonial attire and sing, quote, songs of freedom in front of the White House in a protest of Donald Trump. They were going to sing songs from the musical Les Miserables, Do You Hear the People Sing, et cetera, but parody lyrics against the president. And I thought that this was really funny. It was at the point of time where it seemed like everyone was protesting. Scientists were protesting, lawyers were protesting, women were protesting, and the musical theater people also had to find a way in there. And I just thought that was funny. I disregarded it because I was in Ukraine still. And I didn't think about it again for a couple of years until one day, as part of the Russia investigation, a criminal complaint was unsealed in the District of Virginia that I actually live in. And it said that the Internet Research Agency, Russia's infamous troll factory, as we know it now, had invested $80 in sponsoring an ad on Facebook that was in support of this very protest itself, that they had spent $80 to support a group called Americans Take Action, which organized the protest, and had no idea that they were interfacing with folks from the Internet Research Agency. And so I tracked down one of the organizers. We met, we had coffee and a long, very detailed conversation. And he had absolutely no clue that when he was planning this protest with a bunch of other protest groups in Washington, D.C., that they had been supported by the Russian government or the proxy of the Russian government. And I think this is really interesting. It shows us a couple things. One, this isn't about just silly memes on the internet, right? It actually got people to show up. And we don't know how many people saw that ad and then got converted into actually showing up on July 4th, 2017. But according to the guy who ran the protest, his name is Ryan. Ryan said, this was one of our most successful protest actions that we did. And these were the folks who stood up at Trump's inauguration with resist written on T-shirts. They unfurled a resist banner from the top rafters of the Washington Nationals ballpark on their home opener. They also handed out Russian flags at the Conservative Political Action Conference, very topical for this week. That was in 2017. And then they did this flash mob as well. And Ryan said that he really thought that advertising, which reached tens of thousands of people in the Washington metro area, did encourage a lot of musical theater loving protesters to come out that day. So that's number one. Number two, what's really interesting about this is, again, this wasn't about something that was only pro-Trump. These folks were vehemently against Trump. And in fact, were calling for his impeachment from the very day he was inaugurated. And so we have this sense, again, of polarization that the Russian government was pushing during that time. And eventually Facebook, when it found out that these events were connected to the Russian government, they took down the events. Ryan said that all the chats that he had with the would-be IRA operatives had been deleted from his history. You couldn't even really find very many videos of the event that were still on Facebook. They are still on YouTube, however. And this is a great example of quite complex social engineering and information laundering again. There's also, this has kind of evolved a little bit as we headed toward the 2020 election last year. And rather than, trying to get people out to protest, what we saw was the use of the infrastructure, the ways that social media has evolved since 2016 in order to, again, tweak public opinion a little bit. And this was most evident in the Peace Data operation, which you may have heard of. It was a blip in the very furious news cycle ahead of the election in around September. And this was an operation that actually contracted with real freelance journalists, left-leaning freelance journalists in the United States to write articles related to foreign policy, post them on a website, and then drop those links from the website to Facebook groups that were left-leaning. So they might have been, for instance, in support of Julian Assange or in support of the Kurdish army in Syria or something like that. And these were folks who were very focused. They had a certain political inclination and had created a community around that. And by dropping the links in these Facebook groups where engagement is incentivized, I'm sure you've all noticed that in your own Facebook feeds, that Facebook is really driving you to engage with those groups. They were able to stir up some interest in this website. It didn't get so much engagement before the NSA tipped off Facebook and Twitter and all those properties got taken down. But it's an interesting, again, type of information laundering and kind of two vectors here. One, laundering legitimacy by using real freelance American journalists who got paid for their writing. So it gave it an air of legitimacy in that way. And two, by laundering it through Facebook groups where people could see that link, engage with it, drop it in another group that they're a part of, send it to friends, et cetera, et cetera. It also, interestingly, rather than using a whole bunch of fake accounts, it just used a very small group of fake accounts that had AI-generated profile pictures. So I like to tell this story. It's not in the book, but it shows how our adversaries are adapting their information tactics, although we are playing what I like to call whack-a-troll right now and furiously removing fake accounts. Our adversaries are still adapting to the new information environment and the hoops that the social media platforms and law enforcement agencies are making them jump through. So again, there's a homegrown element to these operations. The second theme from the book is that because there is a homegrown element to these operations, we really need to invest in the human element to countering disinformation. All of the countries that I look at that have had any success in countering Russia understand that Russia is exploiting fissures in our societies and that disinformation isn't just about cut and dry fakes. It's about our real visceral emotion. And you can't legislate how people feel, but you can teach them to support their feelings with credible, authoritative information. And there are two examples in the book that I think explore how this can really work. The first is Estonia. I'm not sure exactly how many of you are familiar with the bronze soldier crisis here gathered today, but in a nutshell, Estonia is a small country on the Baltic Sea, about 1.3 million people that in 1991, when it regained its independence from the Soviet Union, had about 25 to 30% of an ethnic Russian population in Estonia that was left over from the fall of the Soviet Union. And these folks, unfortunately, sort of became second-class citizens in the eyes of the Estonian government. Many of them didn't have Estonian citizenship because they couldn't pass Estonian language exams. They had second-class jobs, essentially blue-collar jobs, because they didn't have a higher education and didn't speak Estonian. They were de facto ghettoized, living in certain parts of the country, in certain parts of the capital, and their children couldn't attend secondary school and university in Estonia because they didn't speak Estonian and grew up in a Russian-speaking household. And so the societal affordances allowed to them were pretty bare, and there were a lot of grievances within the Russian society. And Russia saw this happening, and especially post the accession of Estonia to the European Union and NATO, really saw an opportunity here to exact its influence over a country that was now in the Western orbit, and pursued this policy of really, again, weaponizing the grievances of the ethnic Russian population. And this all came to a head when the Estonian government tried to move a statue to World War II dead from the center of the capital of Estonia, Tallinn, to the outskirts of the city. And Russia essentially fomented a protest through Russian language media and some covert operations in Estonia. It led, unfortunately, to one death and a lot of destruction in the center of the city. And Estonia realized we have a problem on our hands. They also dealt with a cyber attack, and that's what a lot of people focus on when we're talking about 2007 and what we call the bronze soldier crisis in reference to that statue. And Estonia is very, smart about its cybersecurity. It's one of the leaders in cybersecurity and IT in general. They invented Skype. But what I like to focus on from this case study is not the cyber element, although they did beef up their cybersecurity after 2007. It's the human element, the informational element. The response wasn't just in the cyber realm. It wasn't about locking down the information sphere. It wasn't about pushing ethnic Estonians out or fact fact-checking them. It was about reaching out to them and integrating them into society. So investing in Russian language higher educational opportunities, Russian language media, investing in outreach from the government to folks living in Russian enclaves in Estonia. And if you look at the integration statistics, actually, more and more ethnic Russians are adopting an Estonian European identity for themselves. And that's shown in the number of ethnic Russians who now have citizenship, and those, again, who have this self-professed Estonian European identity. And some of that is natural, the older generations dying off, younger generations assuming a more European identity, but there's an upward trend there that is really encouraging and shows that, this isn't just about if you build it, they will come. All of those services existed prior to 2007, but it took an active investment by the Estonian government in these services for people to really get invested and engaged in them. So that's one example. Ukraine has also invested in media literacy in particular, recognizing that their informational problems aren't just about telling a good story, aren't just about, telling a patriotic story in the case of their war with Russia. They are looking to really educate people to navigate a complex and oligarchic information environment. And in partnership with an American NGO called IREX, they have invested in a secondary school education program that throughout the curriculum across Ukraine is teaching Ukrainian students how to discern a trustworthy media source, how to recognize hate speech in that media, how to do a little bit of basic fact checking across the board to discern whether something that is breaking news is trustworthy or not. And they've done this very deliberately because they look to nations like Estonia, like Finland and Sweden that have dealt with informational assaults from Russia in particular for many decades. And those countries all have quite resilient education systems, resilient democracies, and Ukraine decided to prioritize this in their own education system as well. And the statistics there are also encouraging. Students are really retaining that information even months and years after they've first been presented with it. And there's a trickle-up effect as well. When you're teaching students about this stuff, they, by nature of the fact that they go home to their families, talk to their parents about it. And there have also been a couple of pilot projects in Ukraine through libraries that reach out to individuals in their communities, voting age individuals, not just students. And those have shown some positive statistics as well. So here I like to say, if Estonia and Ukraine, two nations that are smaller and less prosperous than the United States, can make these big investments in people and the very human problems at the core of disinformation, then the United States and other Western democracies should absolutely be doing the same thing. So first, again, homegrown element. Second, there needs to be a human element to our solution. And then finally, we cannot fight disinformation when we are embracing its tactics ourselves. And there are two really stark examples of this in my book. One is Poland. Poland is an interesting case study for me because I am Polish American in part. And every time I go to Poland, when I was researching disinformation and researching my book in particular, I was told over and over, Poland is inoculated to Russian disinformation. We are immune. Nothing can touch us with that. We're not going to fall for Russian lies. But what's interesting is that Poland has, in many regards, not only fallen for Russian narratives, but also fallen for domestic disinformation that has now become endemic to the Polish political environment. The biggest political issue for many of the past decade or so in Poland, many of the years of the past decade or so in Poland, has been related to the Smolensk plane crash in 2010 that killed about 100 members of the Polish political elite, and conspiracy theories surrounding that plane crash, that the opposition in Poland worked with the Russian government to bring down the plane so that they could achieve a political coup. And that is why Russia is withholding the wreckage from Poland. And the governing party, Law and Justice, has really used that narrative to propel themselves to power. And until very recently, it was one of the main refrains in Polish politics and was a truly divisive issue in something that should have and was at the very beginning a tragedy for the Polish public that should have brought people together. It really became a polarizing issue in Poland. And Russia has succeeded in driving narratives related to anti-Ukrainian sentiment and homophobic sentiment. Again, two sentiments that exist naturally in Poland, in some parts of Poland. And they've weaponized those narratives. And Poland, unfortunately, has not been immune. But more troubling to me is the fact that the Law and Justice government has actually embraced some of the very tactics that Russia uses as well. Whenever there is discontent in Polish society or a protest movement, we have seen the Law and Justice government invest in its own troll factories to astroturf and try to create the guise of grassroots support online for some of their more controversial policy positions, including their anti-abortion stance or anti-gay stance, for instance. And while the Polish government has some pretty good foreign disinformation policies related to Russia, if you look at their national security doctrine and the systems that they have set up across their government, you can't you can't be a kettle calling the pot black, right? When you are fighting disinformation, you're either against it in all of its forms, or you are tacitly or perhaps explicitly endorsing it. And in the Law and Justice Party's case, we have exactly that, this attempted bifurcation of the two policies. But you can't be against Russian disinformation and use those tactics yourself. So there's a tension there in Poland, and that means that they're really not addressing the domestic disinformation situation, which allows Russia an opening to continue to manipulate public discourse in Poland. And a similar thing is happening in the Republic of Georgia right now, and it couldn't be more timely that we're talking about it today, as just this week, opposition leader Nika Melia was arrested by the governing Georgian Dream Party. It's, again, a similar situation to Poland, except even though the Georgian government, again, has pretty robust counter-disinformation policies in their national security doctrine, what we've seen is less of an informational influence coming from Russia and more of a cultural and economic influence. And I think this is a really important point. We tend to think of disinformation as something that just happens online, but there is a whole dark underworld of corruption and of other mechanisms and vectors of influence that support disinformation, from cultural organizations to think tanks to money laundering operations. And that's very clear in Georgia, where the Georgian Dream government basically has ignored the fact that Russia has annexed 20% of Georgian territory illegally and has begun to cooperate with them on cultural issues, has endorsed the Ruski Mir Foundation, which is essentially a front for Russian influence in many countries, particularly through the Orthodox Church. And we've seen Russian investment increasing in Georgia, which you could say that there is, a calculation to be made there. Of course, Georgia's much smaller than Russia, needs Russian investment in its wine and travel industries in particular to survive. But we've seen an increased opening for Russian influence that many, many Georgians are against. And now with the crackdown, not only on opposition figures like Melia, but on opposition media, it is really leaking into the informational and political sphere. And, folks in the Department of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can say that they're combating Russian disinformation, but it's leaking in through other levers of influence in the country. And that brings us to the United States, my last point for today. I think over the past 4 years, we have been incredibly focused, and rightly so, on the attempted foreign influence in our elections and in our political discourse. And there's a few points that I'll make there. One, as we have seen, it's not just about trolls and bots. We have seen information being laundered into our authentic American discourse through a number of levers, but on both sides of the political spectrum over the past 4 years. So we need to look inward. We need to understand that the grievances in our society, the lack of good governance, the polarization, issues like endemic misogyny, endemic racism, these are issues that our adversaries can weaponize against us and have weaponized against us. And those are the issues we really need to look inward and fix in order to address the problem of foreign interference. We also have much broader problems domestically related to, social media infrastructure, the attention economy, the fact that, the emotional currency is what these social media platforms are making money on and incentivizing, not only for foreign actors to be able to target us to a very precise level of detail, but that domestic actors are increasingly using as well. And that was the main tension during the Trump years for me as a disinformation scholar, very similar to what we see in Poland and Georgia. There are very good people in the United States government trying to deal with these foreign policy problems related to disinformation, but we've seen so many of our own politicians not even tacitly just supporting these issues, but actively engaging in these very tactics that the United States cannot and should not stand for. So again, I'll return to what I started with. Disinformation is not a partisan problem. It is a democratic one, small d. It affects all of us. It affects our participation in the democratic process, because without authoritative information, we can't make informed choices at the ballot box. People are going to get distrustful of institutions. They're going, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, frankly, they are going to disengage from not only democratic discourse, but from one another. And I think we really need to look toward those human investments as we try to heal from, what's been going on in our information space over the past 4 years, and more recently on January 6th in the Capitol, and really start to make long-term generational investments so that our democracy can be based in fact again, and that we can create a more equitable discourse for everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.